What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know what people really think about you when you stop being useful to them? I learned that lesson in the ugliest possible way, and it started with one short message that burned hotter than any bill I ever covered. For years, without much thought, I became the one who paid for everything at Christmas. At first, it was little things, like making sure the grocery bill went through because mom forgot her card or covering the rental car so my brother and his wife could get in from out of state without stress. Then it grew into flights, hotels, meals, and even the matching pajamas someone insisted were tradition, even though I was the one actually footing the bill for that tradition. I told myself it was easier this way, that I was keeping the peace, that I could afford it and they couldn't, and, besides, I got points and miles out of it, which made me feel like I was being smart. But deep down, I knew I was carrying more than anyone was willing to admit. This year felt no different at first. I had already put the catering deposit on my card, booked the house rental, held flights with my points, and paid for the Christmas morning grocery delivery. Everything was in motion, and no one even asked how it was happening, they just assumed it would be done. Then Aunt Denise, who has always had a quiet way of seeing what others miss, forwarded me a screenshot from a side chat I wasn't in. The message came from my sister-in-law Kayla, and it said, "Can you believe Nora still acts like she's some kind of savior every Christmas? Holiday Parasite. Holiday Parasite." I must have read it 10 times. Parasite. The one word that managed to erase years of me quietly paying, covering, making things happen. I stared at it, waiting to feel angry, waiting to feel hurt, waiting for something. But what I felt was clarity. That was the moment it clicked. I was not the parasite. I was the host, and they had been feeding off me without shame. I had been so desperate to keep the family glued together that I let myself become the invisible wallet no one respected. I didn't respond in the chat. I didn't call Kayla. I didn't cry to my mom. Instead, I opened my laptop, pulled up my accounts, and started clicking. I canceled the catering order. I removed my card from the grocery delivery account. I logged into the streaming services and stripped my card from the family plan that I never watched but always paid for. I released the rental hold before it hit my account. I even pulled back the hotel points before they turned into non-refundable bookings. One by one, I unwound the machine I had built to make everyone comfortable. Every time I hit cancel, it was like pulling another brick out of a wall I had built myself. By the time I was done, I had a spreadsheet with every transaction reversed, every refund pending, and every deposit back in my account. I added notes to remind myself of refund windows and cancellation policies, because if anyone thought they could push me to just put it back, I wanted to be sure I had already crossed the point of no return. When I looked at the numbers, I realized I had saved myself over $4,000 in less than an hour. $4,000 that, just like every other year, would have disappeared into other people's plates, beds, and shopping bags while they laughed about me behind my back. I wanted to send something dramatic in the group chat, but I knew better than to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I typed one word, noted. I pressed send and muted the thread. It sat there like a ticking bomb, one word that would tell them something was off, but give them nothing to argue with. I knew the panic would come, that the questions would start, that Kayla would spin some excuse. But this time I wasn't the fixer. I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had pulled the plug on a game I never wanted to play. The Christmas machine was shutting down, and they had no idea yet. The receipts, the refunds, the withdrawals, they were my new armor. And when the fallout came, I was ready to let them sit in the silence I had carried for far too long. I hadn't even waited 20 minutes before the first call came through, Kayla's name lighting up my phone, buzzing again and again. I let it ring, and then I saw the voicemail notification. Her voice, sharp and desperate, filled the recording. "Nora, I don't know what you think you're doing, but if you don't fix this, I'll tell Mom what you really did last year." I hit save. The thing about family patterns is that once you break them, everyone suddenly notices how dependent they were on you, and it was no different with me. Because within a single day of me pulling my card from every account and canceling every payment I had set in motion, the cracks began to show in ways that were almost laughable if they hadn't been so insulting. Since for years I had been the one who made sure everything worked, and now, with a single evening of silence, the machine had stopped, leaving everyone scrambling to figure out why their world wasn't clicking into place as usual. The first ripple hit when the rental house confirmation failed to arrive in Kayla's inbox. And instead of realizing that maybe the reason was that the hold I had placed had expired, because I was the one who always converted those temporary reservations into real bookings, she launched into a frantic back and forth with the company's customer service, blaming them for losing her booking while never once pausing to remember that she hadn't actually done anything to secure it in the first place. Then came the panic about the flights, because Jake had promised his kids that they would be on the early flight Christmas Eve morning, yet what he didn't realize was that I had only placed those seats on hold using my points, and those holds were temporary by design, meaning that unless I converted them into tickets with a payment method, they would simply vanish, which of course they did, and when Jake got the email saying the reservation was no longer valid, his first instinct wasn't to think, maybe I should have checked this myself, but instead to text the group chat with a vague complaint about airline scams, and then add a passive-aggressive comment that somebody dropped the ball this year. The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh out loud, but instead I watched the chat explode with confusion as Mom asked me if I could call them and straighten it out like you always do, while Dad chimed in with a half-hearted, "I'm sure Nora has it under control," because in their minds I was still the safety net, the one who would, eventually, fix it all, just as I always had. But this time I did not reply with reassurance or a solution. Instead, I opened the same spreadsheet where I had tracked years of expenses and added up totals that no one but me had ever seen in black and white. I copied the clean summary. I had prepared 5 columns, one for each Christmas, with line items covering everything from airfare and rental costs to catering deposits, and even the ridiculous matching pajamas that Kayla insisted were tradition. At the bottom of each year, I had included the total, not rounded, not approximated, but exact, and when I looked at those numbers stacked year over year, the reality hit me again. I had personally spent tens of thousands of dollars on holidays that no one even gave me credit for. Without a single word of commentary, I dropped the file into the chat. The silence that followed was almost louder than the usual flood of messages, because no one knew how to respond to cold, hard numbers that told the story more clearly than any argument ever could. Eventually, Melissa sent a single message that said, "Wow," which was about as much spine as she could manage in moments like this, while Jake disappeared entirely. Probably because he realized that he had been laughing in that side chat while I had been covering expenses he never even considered. Kayla, of course, did not stay silent for long, and within half an hour my phone buzzed with a voicemail from her, her tone sharp and shaky at the same time, warning me that if I didn't fix this mess, she would tell Mom what I had really done last year. The threat was hollow and vague, but the fact that she even said it showed me she was scrambling to regain control of a narrative she had lost the second I stopped being the silent wallet in the corner. I saved the voicemail, not because I was scared of what she might say, but because I knew that when people start throwing around threats, it usually means they're desperate and careless, and I wanted to keep a record of that. I didn't reply to her, and I didn't reassure my mother, and I didn't explain myself to anyone, because I had finally realized that every time I tried to explain, I gave them the power to twist my words into excuses they could dismiss. By sending numbers instead of sentences, I had removed their ability to argue, because you can call me selfish, you can call me dramatic, but you cannot erase a ledger of receipts that show who actually paid for the holiday magic everyone took for granted. And yet, as much as I wanted to feel powerful in that moment, the truth is that part of me still ached, because this was my family, and while I had no interest in being their holiday sponsor anymore, I did want them to see me as more than the bank account they joked about behind my back. But when I looked at Kayla's message again, and when I thought about Jake sitting there laughing instead of defending me, I knew that the only way forward was through silence and boundaries, even if it meant being painted as the villain. That night, when the calls finally stopped, I sat in the quiet of my living room and realized that what I had set in motion was no longer just about money. It was about respect, about finally forcing the people who claimed to love me to face the truth of how little they valued me beyond what I could provide. The unraveling had only just begun, and I knew the next move would not come from me but from them, because without me funding the operation, they would finally have to decide whether Christmas was worth paying for themselves or whether the whole tradition collapsed without my invisible hand holding it up. As I turned off my phone for the night, Melissa's name popped up with a private message, just 4 words, "There's more you should know." And before I could even ask what she meant, she sent me a screenshot that made my stomach drop. When Melissa's screenshot finally loaded, the dim little bubble with Kayla's name stacked above Jake's grinning reaction and 2 cousins chiming in with those smug little comments that sound harmless until you read them in the order they were typed, I felt a slow, steady heat move up my spine. Not the loud kind that makes you throw your phone, but the quiet sort that rearranges your priorities without asking for permission, because there it was in plain text, a full paragraph of Kayla, explaining that she was done letting Nora control the holiday, that I hoard the planning to look generous, and that this year we make her pay what she owes or we leave her to dig herself out. Followed by Jake replying with a lazy little joke about me collecting points like a Christmas banker, and I understood, in a way I had refused to name for years, that my generosity had been rewritten as manipulation by people who enjoyed the benefits, but could not stand the idea that I was the one holding the keys. I stared at that chat and felt something subtle, because I suddenly saw my job not as a daughter or a sister desperate to keep the season afloat, but as a project manager facing a broken process, and when I see a broken process, I do not argue. I write the plan, I verify the constraints, I use the policy windows, and I execute. So I put the phone down, opened my laptop again, and began the part of this story that no one sees when holidays look effortless, the unglamorous work of refund codes and grace periods and cancellation terms that people ignore until they need them, which is usually never if I am behind the curtain doing everything right the first time. The catering deposit sat within a 72-hour refund window if canceled in writing, so I sent a brief, polite email and archived the confirmation. Then I forwarded the refund receipt to myself with a subject line that would be very easy to find later, because I knew that when the narrative shifted to claim I had stranded everyone, I would need to show that the money went back where it belonged instead of evaporating into drama. The rental household would expire without a charge if I did not convert it, but the company was notorious for sneaking inconvenience fees when people called to confirm a cancellation, so I did not call. I waited it out. Set a reminder to verify my card statement, and kept a screenshot of the hold details in case someone tried to claim I sabotaged the reservation after the fact. The flights were nothing more than held seats funded by points, and because I had not pressed the final button that binds you to taxes and change fees, those points slid back into my account like they were never gone. And I took a long minute to savor how quickly the balance recovered when I stopped spending it on people who would not even say my name kindly in a private chat. Then I did the thing no one would expect from the alleged parasite who craved control. I quietly booked a simple dinner for Christmas Eve for me and my parents at a local place that does not play games with prix-fixe menus or forced wine pairings. A place that allows separate checks without rolling their eyes, and I used a reservation app that sends a clean confirmation in my name with a note about accessibility for Dad's knee, because whatever else was about to burn down in the family chat, I was not going to let my parents eat leftovers on a folding chair just because the rest of the crew preferred performances to planning. I did not publish this reservation, I did not drop it into the chat, and I did not invite commentary, because this was not a counterplay. It was a quiet act of respect for the 2 people who raised me and who, even in their messiest moments, never called me a parasite. With the big costs undone, I turned to the shared accounts that I had allowed to grow around my card like ivy around a mailbox, the streaming bundle that Kayla insisted on because the kids needed new holiday specials, the family Amazon that defaulted to my payment method no matter how many times I reset it, the grocery delivery subscription that locked in free primetime windows that only I could reserve and which Kayla adored because it made her feel like a scheduling wizard. And I removed my card from each one, not angrily, not punitively, just firmly, and as I did, I took screenshots of the settings pages with their neat little no payment method on file. Icons that I knew would become important if anyone tried to claim I had staged a crisis at the last minute. I also scrubbed my email of the old auto-forwarding rules I had created to keep order, those clever filters that shuttled confirmation codes and delivery updates to a shared folder so they could pretend they were handling logistics, because I had realized that most of the labor they claimed as theirs was nothing more than my automation making them look competent, and my tolerance for that illusion had expired. Melissa, who has perfected the role of Switzerland in our family, sent a second message that was equal parts apology and excuse, and while I appreciated the apology, I declined the excuse, telling her, in a single long breath that I knew she would read 3 times before responding, that I loved her, but I would no longer translate my kindness into silence so other people could feel like leaders, and that from this point on, any cost not explicitly agreed and prepaid by the person who wanted it would not exist in my world because I was done underwriting other people's wish lists. She typed the little dots, paused, and then said she understood, which in our language means she will not stop Kayla, but she will not join her either, and that was enough for the moment. By the afternoon, the group chat had entered its second stage of grief, the bargaining phase, with Jake tossing out ideas like splitting everything evenly, like grown-ups, as if I had not been proposing exactly that for years. And Kayla drifting between faux confusion, I thought we already paid you for last year. Maybe it didn't go through, and thinly veiled threats. Mom needs to know what Nora did with the gift money, which is funny, because the gift money she referenced was a last-minute digital collection that barely covered stockings, and which I had covered anyway when our aunt's package got delayed, and I had the receipt to prove it, just like I had receipts for everything else. I felt a surge of calm that surprised me, the kind that accompanies proof, and I posted a single message that said that I had canceled the items that were on my card, that all funds had been returned to their original sources or reclaimed as points because nothing had been issued, and that anyone who wanted to proceed was free to do so with their own payment methods, at which point I would provide the contact information for vendors and step aside. Here is the part that stung even as it validated my choice. Within minutes, the chat shifted from outrage to paralysis, because without me in the driver's seat, no one seemed to know what came next, and instead of rolling up their sleeves, they turned on one another, arguing over whose turn it was to handle the tree and who had promised to order the appetizers, and whether the cheaper house out by the highway was beneath us, a phrase I will hear in my sleep for years, not because it offended me, but because it revealed what this had always been about for Kayla, the appearance of being the family who had it all together, which only works when someone else pays for the glue. I let them stew, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted them to see the space where my labor used to be, and while they argued about prestige, I printed the refund confirmations, filed them in a folder labeled with dates and terms, and thought about how strange it is that the simplest acts, saying no, pressing cancel, booking a small dinner for the people who matter, can feel like a revolution when you have been trained to make yourself small. Just as I closed the folder, a new voicemail arrived from an unknown number, and when I pressed play, I heard Kayla's voice clipped and formal as she announced that she had spoken to the rental company and that someone had called to flag my account as the payer. Which meant, she said with that satisfied little lilt she uses when she thinks she has found leverage, that any cancellation fees would be yours, and before I could even decide whether to laugh or scream, I opened my email and saw a message from the rental company that said, in one careful sentence, that due to a prior incident on file, the booking could not proceed under her name without a larger deposit, and I realized she had just stepped on a rake she did not know was in the grass. When Kayla's smug voicemail landed, her voice carrying that false confidence of someone who believes they have finally cornered you, I realized she had no idea what she had stepped into. Because while she thought threatening me with cancellation fees would send me scurrying back into the role of fixer, the truth was that I had already checked the fine print, verified the deadlines, and locked every detail into a timeline that guaranteed I was free and clear. So her little announcement was not a threat, it was a confession that she was scrambling, and nothing reveals character more quickly than desperation. I listened twice, not because I doubted her words, but because I wanted to memorize the tone, the blend of arrogance and fear, and then I saved the recording next to the first voicemail she left, building my own quiet archive of proof that would tell the story without me needing to embellish it. By then the family group chat had devolved into finger-pointing, with Jake lobbing half-serious suggestions about splitting costs that sounded noble until you remembered that he never actually followed through, Mom pleading for everyone to keep the spirit of Christmas alive, as if Spirit alone paid deposits, and Kayla alternating between playing victim and taking shots at me for abandoning everyone, though her version of abandonment meant no longer handing over my card like an ATM with a smile. Normally, in years past, I would have folded under the pressure. I would have typed out some long explanation about wanting to keep things smooth and easy, and then I would have quietly swallowed the resentment while putting everything back in place just so no one fought. But this time I refused to do it, because I had finally understood that explaining myself was not the same thing as being respected, and that the people who benefit from your silence will always demand it, right up until you stop giving it. So instead of justifying or pleading, I prepared something they could not twist, a single document that laid out, year by year, exactly what I had covered, not as a rant, not as a martyr's list, but as a ledger so clean that no one could accuse me of exaggeration. 5 Christmases, each broken down into line items: flights, rental houses, catering deposits, groceries, streaming bundles, shipping fees, and even those ridiculous matching pajamas that Kayla declared were essential for family photos, though they were always ordered on my Amazon account. At the bottom of each year, I placed the total in words, because I knew that numbers can be dismissed as abstractions, but when you read $6,400, the reality lands harder than a digit on a page. I did not editorialize, I did not highlight my sacrifices, I simply stacked the facts in black and white, because facts are harder to argue with than feelings, and I was done being dragged into emotional corners where logic evaporates. When I dropped that file into the chat, the silence that followed was unlike any silence I had heard from them before, not the casual pause when someone is busy, not the distracted gap between jokes, but the heavy, stalled kind of silence that falls when people realize the truth has stripped them of their excuses. Melissa sent the first reply, just one word, wow, which was more spine than she usually showed, while Dad stayed out of the thread entirely, and Mom responded with a half-hearted, I didn't realize it was so much, which stung more than I wanted to admit, because she had watched me swipe my card every single year and had simply chosen not to add it up. Jake disappeared, of course, slipping into the same shadows he always hides in when things get messy, and Kayla finally responded with a long paragraph about how family isn't about money and how making lists ruins the holiday spirit, as if pretending bills don't exist was some kind of noble virtue, when in reality it was just another way of keeping me quiet. This time, instead of arguing back, I decided to add one more move to the game, something simple, almost laughably small, but designed to make a point that could not be ignored. I opened my payment app and sent each adult in the family a request for $1 single, with the memo line reading, "Proof you can pay me." It was petty, it was sarcastic, but it was also devastating, because within minutes I could see who accepted, who ignored, and who rejected the request. Melissa paid immediately with no comment. Dad sent it twice, probably confused by the app, but I let it stand. Jake ignored it. Kayla declined it with a note that said ridiculous, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. Then, while they were busy fuming about my gall, I took the refund deposits I had recovered and redirected a portion to a local food pantry that was running low for the season, attaching our family's name to the donation receipt. Because if they wanted to accuse me of being selfish, I wanted the record to show that at least some of that money went to people who genuinely needed it rather than adults who couldn't be bothered to split a check. I forwarded the receipt into the chat with no commentary, letting the stark contrast speak louder than any lecture could, because nothing undercuts a narrative of selfishness like proof that your so-called selfishness fed 50 families for a week. That should have been enough for me, but then the phone rang again, and this time it wasn't Kayla or Jake or Melissa, it was Mom, her voice trembling, saying that Dad had fallen in the driveway and that she was at urgent care and could I please come. In that moment, all the fury and all the strategy fell away, because family fights may be ugly, but they dissolve instantly when someone you love is hurt. I grabbed my keys and drove, not thinking about ledgers or receipts, but about whether Dad would be okay, and when I arrived, I found him propped up with a bandage on his arm and a prescription slip that Mom couldn't navigate because the pharmacy system was confusing. I handled it without hesitation, not because I owed them, but because love and loyalty are not measured in dollars, they are measured in showing up when it matters. On the drive home, though, the weight of everything pressed back down on me, because I realized that even if I showed up for my parents, I could no longer show up for the holiday in the same way, and that meant something bigger than money was about to change. The ledger was out, the receipts were undeniable, and the power dynamics had shifted, but the real test was still coming, because when you stop being the wallet, you force people to face who you are without that role. And I wasn't sure if they were capable of doing that honestly. The next morning, as I made coffee, my phone lit up with a new message in the family chat, not from Kayla or Jake this time, but from Dad himself, who had never once typed in that thread before, and all it said was, "Dinner tomorrow. Rules change now." When I woke the next morning and saw the message from Dad, short, direct, and typed out in his clumsy way that usually made him call one of us instead of using the keyboard, I realized immediately that something had shifted in the house where I grew up. Because my father had never once inserted himself into the chaos of the family group chat, not when fights broke out over who hosted Thanksgiving, not when Kayla insisted on posting a dozen links to overpriced must-haves, and not even when Jake and I clashed years ago about who would drive Mom to her appointments, so when he wrote only 4 words, "Dinner tomorrow." Rules change now, it felt like a door closing on one version of our family and opening on another, and for the first time in a long time, I sensed he had finally seen what I had been carrying. The hours that followed were filled with an eerie kind of quiet, the kind that usually precedes a storm, because the chat went silent except for a brief "okay" from Melissa, who never risked defying Dad, while Kayla and Jake said nothing, which for them was more telling than any insult, since silence was never their style unless they were regrouping, plotting a way to reclaim control. I decided not to poke the bear, not to message, not to explain, because at this point words were only ammunition for people determined to twist them, and I had already learned that receipts, rules, and actions spoke louder than any carefully constructed defense. Instead, I prepared myself for what I knew tomorrow's dinner would represent, not just a meal, but a reckoning. That afternoon, I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote out a plan, not because I needed to script every move, but because I wanted to remind myself that I was not walking into that dinner as the family bank, the fixer, the quiet mule they could load with costs and guilt. I was walking in as a woman who had finally put her foot down after years of being used. I pulled together every document, the refunds processed, the cancellation confirmations, the food pantry donation receipts, even the $1 payment requests, and I stored them neatly in a folder titled "My Last Christmas as Your Wallet." I knew I might never need to show it, but simply having it gave me a calm sense of preparation, the kind of calm you feel when you know you can prove your case even if no one asks you to. When the evening came, I drove to the small restaurant I had quietly booked days earlier, the one that had confirmed separate checks and reserved a comfortable table for Dad, and when I walked in, I saw my parents already seated, looking tired but strangely unified, like they had finally decided to stand together on something instead of defaulting to Mom smoothing things over and Dad staying out of it. Dad handed me an envelope before I even sat down, and inside was a short handwritten note in his uneven scrawl, saying that he and Mom had known for years that I was covering more than I should have, that they had let it happen because it kept the peace, and that they were sorry for not stopping it sooner. Attached was a modest certificate with my name on it, something he had opened years ago as a backup savings plan, and he told me it was his way of showing me that I had been seen all along, even if they hadn't spoken up. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened, because in that Small gesture, my parents admitted what I had long suspected. They knew, and they had been complicit. As we ordered, the door opened, and the rest of the family walked in, Melissa tentative, Jake sullen, and Kayla trying to look composed, but radiating irritation. They sat down, and for a long moment no one spoke, until Dad cleared his throat and said plainly that things would be different, that he was tired of watching me carry everything, and that from now on, if anyone wanted a tradition, they would pay for it themselves. No IOUs, no vague promises, no guilt trips. Mom nodded along, her face pale but resolute, and for the first time in memory, my parents set boundaries without flinching. Kayla tried to interject, talking about holiday spirit and family unity, but Dad cut her off with a sharpness I hadn't heard since I was a child, saying that unity built on one person's exhaustion was no unity at all. Jake stayed quiet, perhaps realizing that siding with his wife would only dig him deeper, and Melissa, in her soft way, said she understood, which was her form of agreement. The server came, took separate orders, and when the meal ended, the checks were laid down individually, each person reaching for their own bill with varying levels of awkwardness. No one dared push their slip toward me, no one hinted at a cover me this time favor, and in that quiet exchange I felt a seismic shift, because the unspoken rule of me as the default payer had been broken. As we left, I placed the envelope Dad had given me back into my purse, not because of the money, but because of what it symbolized: acknowledgement, a promise that I would no longer be invisible. Driving home, I thought about the word Kayla had thrown so carelessly into that side chat, Parasite, and how, in the end, it had forced me to stop being what she and the others expected, which was the host keeping them alive without ever being thanked. Parasite had become liberation because it snapped me awake to how badly I had been used, and it gave me the push to end it on my terms. The next morning, I typed one final message into the group chat, short but decisive: from now on, you pay your own way. No shared cards. No reimbursements. No exceptions. I attached the folder I had labeled and left the group chat entirely, starting one-to-one threads with each person instead, so no one could hide behind group silence again. I muted the notifications and set my phone face down, knowing I had delivered the final move in a plan I had not even known I was building until it unfolded piece by piece. As I sat there, sipping coffee in the quiet of my kitchen, I thought about how family can twist generosity into expectation, and how easy it is to lose yourself when you are afraid to be the one who says no, and I felt something I had not felt in years: control, peace, and a strange satisfaction that I had broken the cycle without screaming, without begging, and without giving them what they wanted most, which was my silence. Do you know your true worth? I learned mine the moment I stopped paying, and I can promise you this: nothing about that decision was cruel, but everything about it was brilliant.